All right, it's just 2 o'clock now, so just want to welcome everybody here to our webinar. So thank you for joining us for part one of our 4-part series on termite control and biology. Before we get started, we'll go over a few housekeeping rules. Please, everyone, mute your line. If you have questions, please place them in the chat. We will be answering all questions at the end of the webinar. If you have any additional questions, you can email them to education@nola.gov. And this webinar will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. Today's topic is termite biology and identification. And our speakers today are Dr. Carrie Coutone and Dr. Mark Janowicki. Dr. Carrie Coutone has been employed by the City of New Orleans Mosquito, Termite, and Rodent Control Board for the past 19 years. She received her PhD in entomology in 2011 as a distance education student at the University of Florida. Her research focused on survival mechanisms of Formosan subterranean termite colonies during times of prolonged flooding. Until recently, she managed the insect genetics lab at Mosquito Control. She is currently the Assistant Director of Mosquito Control and still works with collaborators to test new products and formulations for termite treatments. Our other speaker, Dr. Mark Janowicki, is an Ohio native and completed his undergraduate degree in entomology at The Ohio State University. Next, Mark joined Dr. Alan Solansky's lab at the University of Arkansas to complete his master's degree in entomology, studying tools to differentiate termite populations and species. Mark went on to complete his PhD with Dr. Edward Vargo at Texas A&M University. His project investigated physiological and behavioral factors that influence native subterranean termite colony spatial dynamics. In September of 2020, Mark joined the City of New Orleans Mosquito, Termite, and Rodent Control Board, where he is currently running and expanding the molecular laboratory and leading the termite division. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Coutone and Dr. Janowicki.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. So I always like to start out talking about termites in more of a nice way than a destructive way. I like to let everybody know that termites are actually pretty beneficial to our ecosystem. This is something that most people don't realize, right? They are wood recyclers. They are rare and that they can feed on wood and break down cellulose to release those nutrients back into the ecosystem. They are actually a really good source of protein for many other animals, right? So there are reptiles, amphibians, and even mammals that exploit termites from their colonies and swarming termites to get a good source of protein. However, they are considered pests when they damage things that we hold near and dear. So something like your house or ornamental trees and shrubs, things that we value. Once termites start to feed on them, then we definitely consider them pests. And termites can feed on anything that contains cellulose, but they do rely on a symbiotic relationship with bacteria and protozoa to digest their wood. So with all the termite species in the world, just keep in mind that fewer than 10% of those are actually considered pests. So termite colonies, termites are social, so they have a caste system. And every caste within a termite colony serves a specific role for that colony. So, for example, workers are the most abundant caste in a termite colony, and these are the ones that are actually responsible for doing all the damage. They're the ones that will feed on the wood. Soldiers and reproductives are the two other castes in a termite colony. Soldiers, as the name would imply, is they are responsible for defending the colony And reproductives are those swarming termites that you see during certain times of the year. They are the ones that are flying from one colony to go pair up and mate and start another colony. These are also called alates. So termites are very well distributed throughout the world. They're found everywhere except for Antarctica, right? A little bit too cold there. But they are found throughout the globe. This map here represents um, the three termite families that we're going to be discussing today. We have Termitidae, which is the dry woods, Rhinotermitides, which are the subterranean termites, and the Termitidae, which are the higher termites. Now, when you think of their diversity, this map shows their diversity, but if you think abundance, it's not an even spread throughout the world. So you can see here in North America, we don't have as many termites as other parts of the world, even though we do have a very fair share of termite issues. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of do a termite tour around the world. We're going to start on other continents and work our way back home, talking about termite diversity that's out there. So starting in Africa, African termites include subterranean termites, drywood termites, harvester termites, and the higher termites. And I'm going to go through each one of these a little bit here. Okay, so subterranean termites, as its name implies, they nest under the ground. They can nest within living and dead trees and logs. They are very well known for building their shelter tubes, their mud tubes above the soil surface. That helps protect them from drying out. They are very soft-bodied insects. They're very prone to desiccation, drying out. They create carton nests to live in, and this is a pest of huge economic importance. The drywood termites, on the other hand, they will have smaller colonies than subterranean termites. As their name implies, they live within sound, dead or dry wood. So they're living within the space that they're getting their food source from. Okay, they don't construct nests, but they will excavate galleries within dry wood. And it's very characteristic that those galleries will become packed with their fecal pellets, which they will eventually clean house and start kicking them out of their galleries. So you'll end up with piles of these very distinct looking fecal pellets from drywood termites. That's one of the telltale signs of a drywood infestation. Harvester termites, this is something that we don't deal with in the United States. These termites will nest underground and they will gather and collect food for later use. So they're feeding mainly on grasses, things like that. They forage at night in the summer and by day in the winter, right? So they're not going to be out foraging in the heat of the day, under the African sun. They're way too prone to drying out. Evidence of these termites can be seen when they will dump small piles of soil and debris from an underground nest like they're kicking it out. And I believe we have a video here. Mark, can you hit play? Okay. So here is some video taken of some harvester termites in Africa. You can see they are pulling all these grasses underground. They're coming out of a hole where they gain entrance to their nest. This is their nest entrance. And you can see they're kind of working together, gathering, and working so hard to bring all that grass underground. There goes one. Okay. Higher termites in Africa. This is a very diverse group of termites. There's a wide range of nesting and feeding habitats. So higher termites in Africa include rounded mound building termites and arboreal nest builders, soil feeders, and fungus growers. And these fungus growing termites, they fall into the family Macrotermitidae, and they are known to construct these very large, elaborate nests. So if you're driving through Africa, they're really difficult to miss. These nests can be huge. These mounds can be huge. So within this mound, there is a series of galleries and chimneys that are all constructed to help regulate the temperature so it doesn't get too hot, and it regulates the humidity so nobody's going to dry out. They keep that humidity in there pretty high. So the subterranean nest cavity is also filled with a fungus comb towards the bottom, as you can see here in this diagram as well. So there is a symbiotic relationship between termites and the fungus that they're cultivating, right, which assists in food digestion. And the queen is also housed at the base of that mound within a main nest cavity. And inside that mound, so here are some pictures taken. The one on the left is what the fungus comb actually looks like. So that is where the fungus is cultivated, that they feed on. And it looks very much like everybody kind of says it's analogous to, say, a brain, right? Somebody's organ. It's got a lot of surface area on there. And then as you get to the top, you can have really intricate galleries and chimneys within the tops of those mounds. So the picture on the right, it's actually a zinc casting that we did of the top of one of these termite mounds, and you can really see how those galleries kind of extend out. So Australia is another continent with a pretty large diversity of termite species. There are subterranean termites, drywood termites, higher termites, and then there's also the mastotermes that live there. Okay, so the subterranean termites in Australia, of the genus Coptotermes, they can build mounds with also very extensive gallery systems, and other species are fully subterranean, so they live completely underground. The termites themselves look very similar to other Coptotermes species, so they look very similar to our Formosan subterranean termites that we have here in New Orleans. I was lucky enough to come face to face with some of these Coptotermes mounds in Australia. And there's a picture of me looking much younger than I do today. But I was able to actually crack inside that termite mound, and figure out what species was making those. So the thing that really surprised me is these mounds are really, really hard to break into. They are much tougher than they look. But once you get inside, it's almost like crunching on the outside to get to a chewy center. So it's much softer mud that's been built in the center of those. So drywood termites, and again, very small colonies living within sound dead or dry wood. Um, Again, excavating galleries within their wood, and their presence is detected by those piles of fecal pellets. So the higher termites in Australia include arboreal species, which will build their nest up in trees, and mound building termites. So these are the ones that a lot of people have taken notice of from National Geographic or Nova specials, where these are the compass termites, right? So they will build these very high but kind of flat looking mounds, flattened side to side, where they just look like they're straight up and down, like that picture on the top right. And they're called compass termites because their mounds are always oriented north-south rather than east-west. And the reasoning behind that is that they take advantage of the sun coming up in the morning and the late afternoon, but they're not going to cook inside their mound. They're not getting that noonday Australian sun, right? So it's not going to get too hot in there. There's also these cathedral termites. So you can see in the bottom picture there how large these mounds can really get. So for scale, there's a person standing right next to that termite mound. In Australia, we also have Mastotermes. So this is the sole living species of this genus, this Mastotermes darwiniensis. It's a very primitive termite. It looks very primitive, very stout, very sclerotized head capsule there. It's only found in northern Australia. And these termites do nest below the soil surface. I'm going to let Mark take it over from here. Let's continue on with our global tour.
Okay, sounds good. So I'll take us over to Asia. So in Asia, there's the most diversity of termites. So 1 in 3 species of termites are there. So a third of all species known are there. But many of this still needs work. Many of these species are synonymous. So a synonymous species is a term we use when a single species is described by 2 different people. Basically, there's 2 names given to the same species. So one person described it, put it in a museum. The next person came along, found the same thing, wasn't able to access the old specimens or thought it looked different enough and called it a new species. So there's a lot of taxonomic work needed in this area, as there's many, many records of species that might or might not be real. A notable example of an Asian type of termite are the fungus-growing termites, Odontotermes. So these are much like the fungus-growing termites we already saw, where they're collecting material, and rather than consuming the material themselves, they let the fungus do the digestion and then eat the byproducts of this. They rely on their younger workers to chew up the material and mix it with the fungus to get this fungal comb going. And then once it ripens or matures, they're feeding on those older portions of the fungal comb. So this is another example of agriculture that's been going on for many, many years before humans even existed. Next, we'll head to the neotropics, and this is an area where I have some experience. So I got to spend about a month or so in Costa Rica surveying the termites there. So I'll tell some kind of stories from my time there. But in the neotropics, there's about 20% of all termite species, or 1 in 5. Some examples I'll go through here are the conehead termites, some asymmetrical snapping soldier termites, and then what I like to call the unicorn termites. That might not be their official common name. So the conehead termites, or arboreal termites, are similar to the ones that Carrie mentioned in Australia. These have those distinctive cone-shaped heads, as you see the individuals in there. So the soldiers have these cone heads, and rather than having defensive mandibles that they can chew on or defend different things from the colony, they use these heads as a spray nozzle. So they spray a defensive chemical out of this and are able to keep predators and different things out of the nests or away from the workers. They also build these big arboreal nests that are very obvious. So you can see in the picture on the left, this nest is bigger than a football, so it's a pretty good size. And it's again that carton material. So this isn't something that you can just punch right through. It takes a machete and a hammer and some things to really get inside of here if you're trying to get these termites out of there. So they're hiding in plain sight, but they're so sturdy that it's okay. They're not going to be attacked by predators. Whereas many other termites have a much more fragile nest, but they hide them away in areas where they're not going to be seen. In Costa Rica, I also came across the asymmetrical snapping soldiers. So the soldiers can either have those mandibles, large mandibles for defense, or the nozzle head spraying like mandibles. But in this case, they have 2 large mandibles, but they don't have much strength in them. As you see these mandibles in the picture on the left, get the laser pointer here. So these mandibles here are very long and very slender, and they don't look the same. They're curved and kind of sickle shaped. But what they do is just like how you can make a really big snapping noise by snapping your fingers. And when you push your fingers together, you're putting a lot of energy into that. And then when you snap, all that energy is released. These termites do the same thing when they squeeze these mandibles together as hard as they can, getting a lot of potential energy built up. And then when it finally reaches the breaking point, it snaps with a very fast speed. So I can play the video here. So the video on the right shows a couple of these conehead termites approaching the soldier of the snapping soldiers. And so when it gets close, he realizes it's there. He pushes his mandibles and snaps. And so you can see that snapping motion. I don't think it was this species, but another species of termite with the snapping mandibles is actually the fastest recorded speed by any animal on the planet. So it used to be, the trap giants or the mantid shrimp, but the termites have retaken the lead, and they have the fastest motion of any animal on the planet. So this is some of the fastest thing. And to do that, it took a lot of slow motion photography and very, very high tech systems, because it's, in most cameras, it would be less than a single frame. This entire motion. I also found in Costa Rica the unicorn termites, and I call it unicorn for a couple of reasons. Partially, it has this very, very long snout. You see this long, slender snout that it uses for its defensive chemicals. But interestingly, I've been talking about categories of either they have mandibles or a snout. This one has both. So there's this group of termites that have both, this slender snout for spraying a defensive chemical and mandibles. So they use these to grab on with these mandibles, and then they can keep spraying this toxin onto whatever's attacking it. So they would just grab on, almost like a burr or something that you might get caught on your pants. They would grab on, hold onto there, and then just keep pumping out the contents of their nozzle. I call these unicorn as well because they were kind of like a unicorn for me. I was the first time I was in Costa Rica, I spent a couple of weeks, and I was the termite guy in the group, and there were lots of other entomologists. And no one else was really into termites, but it seemed like everyone else would come across these termites and tell me where they were, and I'd go racing off to find them, and they wouldn't be there anymore. These termites have an interesting habit, like the harvesting termites, where they're actually moving on the surface of the soil, and they move around in waves and in different areas, but it's very temporary. As soon as they, find a food resource and move on, then they're back to being underground or covered in leaf litter. So people would constantly come back and tell me, I saw termites in this random place, and sometimes they would bring me a few of them. And so I was teased by this termite the whole time I was there. It took me weeks before I was actually able to find it, despite running out in the field as soon as anyone said it. So this was my unicorn termite, and I think they look a lot like unicorns with their long snout there. As we go further south, a notable example of some of these different termites in Brazil are these giant mounds built in the northeast part of Brazil. This is another one in the same group with the mandibles and the snout in that Serie-Termite group within the higher termites. But these are notable for these giant mounds. So these are actually visible from satellites. So this is a look on Google Earth. You can see all these mounds that they have. They're 7 to 13 feet high, and they're not actually living in these mounds. These mounds are just waste piles. So they're excavating underground, and when they do that, they need somewhere to dump all the dirt. They throw them in these piles and create all of these mounds just sitting in this area. It's thought to be the most extensive bioengineering effort by a single insect species, with over 2.3 cubic miles of soil being moved by these termites. So that's quite a big ordeal. As we get into the US, this is what we'll focus on probably for the remainder of the webinars. We have about 40 or so species of termites here. We have a few dampwoods, about 22 drywood species, 16 of the higher termites, the termitine group or termitidae group, and then 16 different species of subterranean termites across the country. For our dampwood termites, these are usually not considered a pest. These have a very Western distribution. Some of these get very, very large. These are some of the biggest, coolest ones. I've gone searching for them and haven't been successful, but I've seen some of these in vials before. So these are a very large one, but only in this very, very damp environment where the wood is completely soaked. We also have the drywood termites, which we'll be addressing quite a bit more in this seminar, but there's 4 of them that are included as pest species. Cryptotermes brevis is spread all around the world as an invasive species. There's a couple species of Incisitermes and Marginitermes hubbardii. And so these termites require high humidity. And because of this, besides the example of a few desert species that are out there kind of ruining the distribution there, but for the most part, these have a very coastal distribution. So you'll find them in coastal areas, especially as you get down into Florida and South Texas. A lot of these areas have many more of these drywood termites, which, in places in Florida, you could just count on regularly fumigating your house on a regular basis because they're going to keep reestablishing and needing to be exterminated. For our higher termites, the termitidae group, most of these are not considered pests. Some of them, the desert termite, which is in the middle picture there, the Gnathamitermes, these can be a pasture pest. They can actually eat some of the grass and different materials that the cows are grazing on. But most of these are not a problem. There is one species kind of in western Texas, Termites, or actually 2 species in this genus, that have that cone-like or that cone nozzle head on the top. So they look a lot like the cone head termites, but they're a little bit different. And also in Florida, there's a wide variety of some of these kind of relics or unique species out there. So the conehead termite, as I mentioned and saw in Costa Rica, is also invasive in some of the US, and particularly in South Florida. And so this is a major pest in the tropics. So this is out there and it can move into a house and consume the wood and different things. It feeds on a variety of cellulose food sources and grows very quickly. It's in the US, it's been intercepted in ports almost 120 times between 1984 and 2011. So that's a lot of times that it's coming into the port. and being intercepted. How many of those are successful? There's at least one example. So it's had 118 tries, and at least one of them made it. I'm sure 118 is an underestimate from the many that were missed, so we're not inspecting everything closely. But it was discovered in Dania Beach, Florida in 2001. The idea here is that it was very near a private marina, so it probably came in, a colony was on a boat, and it swarmed from that boat. It went to the nearest lights available and hit lights up on the shore, and began to establish colonies there. It was eradicated at that time with a large effort, but was discovered only 13 miles away 15 years later. And so the question was, is this a brand new introduction to the same spot 13 miles away of a new introduction, or is this the same one? So molecular evidence showed that this is actually, the same introduction. So it was likely that that 2001 infestation was not adequately destroyed or not eradicated from the area. It was probably knocked down to very small numbers, and then 15 years went down the road, and it came back and was found again. So finally, our subterranean termites, and the majority of these webinars and a lot of what we talk about will be focused on these subterranean termites, as these are some of the worst ones that we deal with here in the US and the most common across the US. As you can see, most of the US has these. As you get far enough north, you'll kind of lose some of these termites if they can't survive those winters, but a majority of the US has these. Our major pest species are the invasive Coptotermes formosanus, the Formosan subterranean termite, the eastern subterranean termite, Reticulotermes flavipes, and the western subterranean termite, Reticulotermes hesperus. So as the name implies, the Formosan subterranean termite is not native to the US. It's native to Eastern Asia. It likely returned to the US and shipped after World War II from Hawaii and China. And so a more recent molecular characterization from one of my lab mates when I was in Texas, Alex Blumenfeld, used some sophisticated molecular markers to be able to really figure out the source population. So that's always the question of, an invasive species, where did it come from? Where can we trace it back to? Can we understand that pattern? So what he found is this bridgehead effect. And so a bridgehead is a term borrowed from military operations, but this is the introduction of a species from an already invasive population rather than its native population. So in this example, the Formosan subterranean termite was introduced at least a couple times into Hawaii around the 1880s, is what his methods suggest for a timeline. At that point, there was a new population that formed from these introductions in Hawaii, and that was what was introduced into the Louisiana, Texas, somewhere in the southeast United States. There was also a second introduction at some point from mainland China over into Florida, so that's represented by the green bar there. Since then, it's been transported all over the US, but it's important to know there's been multiple introductions, which helps it get past that bottleneck effect. This bridgehead effect is very common in invasive species. It's very easy to move them from places where they're not already meant to be. Another example is the red imported fire ant, which we're very familiar with here in the southeast US. We brought it up from South America, or it was brought up here to the southeast US. And from there, we've since shipped it from the US to other parts of the world as they've done genetic studies to test this. We've sent it to Australia and many different areas. It's coming now from us rather than from South America. But the Formosan subterranean termite has invaded Hawaii, Japan, Southeast US, is one of the 100 worst invasive species. So it's very voracious. Another invasive termite that I want to talk about that's probably going to be getting more and more attention as time goes on is the Asian subterranean termite, Coptotermes gastroi. So this is the tropical cousin of the Formosan subterranean termite. They look very similar. Pardon my poor photo quality here, but these are two soldiers lined up next to each other. So you can see there's very subtle differences. There's a different number of hairs on the fontanelle, which I don't have shown here, but the fontanelle is in the middle picture. And there's a couple of hairs, 2 hairs in one species, 3 in the other. And the profile of the head, the Formosan is less sunken, whereas gastroi is a little more sunk. But these are very subtle, and without the two next to each other, it's very difficult to tell them apart. What's important also is that they've been found to hybridize. So they're able to hybridize between the Asian subterranean termite and the Formosan subterranean termite, first in laboratory colonies, and more recently, these hybrids have been found in the field in Taiwan and South Florida. Initially, these colonies grow faster, and depending on how these temperature tolerances of the hybrids are, this may allow the Asian subterranean termite, which is more tropical and probably won't make it too far out of South Florida, this might allow it to spread further into the United States. This is very, very important for termite control because this Coptotermes gastroi, the Asian subterranean termite, doesn't hit bait stations in the ground in the same way that the formosan does. So it's going to be important to monitor for this spread. If the Asian subterranean termite pops up in New Orleans or different parts of the country, or if these hybrids pop up, it's going to be important to know what we're dealing with to have successful control of these species. So we think a lot about things that have been introduced into the United States, but the U.S. is also exporting things. So I mentioned fire ants, but a U.S. termite has invaded into Europe. So Reticulotermes flavipes, our eastern subterranean termite, is native here to the U.S., but it's since been found in France, Austria, Germany, and Italy. And ironically, its initial description was in Vienna, Austria. And so whoever describes the first time they find a species, they get to appoint that that material and put it into a museum. And so the initial material for Reticulotermes flavipes is from collected in Vienna in a greenhouse where it was invasive. Some molecular analysis has found that Louisiana may be a source population for the species in France, and this makes sense as there was a lot of transportation between New Orleans and France in the early 17th and 18th centuries. And it was detected in a lot of these port cities. So it's coming in again with boats and trade. So it's important to really see what's traveling back and forth in these different areas. For our more local focus, I'll pass it back to Carrie to talk about our Louisiana termites.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mark. Yeah, so here in Louisiana, we have 5 species of subterranean termites and 4 species of drywood termites. So the subterranean termite group, of course, includes the very well-known Formosan subterranean termite, the introduced Coptotermes formosanus, as well as some native species of subterranean termites that apparently we are very good at introducing to other countries, right? Just like Mark just said. The 4 species of drywood termites that we have include the light southern drywood, western drywood, West Indian wood, and the dark southern drywood. So to get kind of into the nitty gritty here, I know that so far we have kind of lumped all subterranean termites into one category, which they are all in the same family, but there are some very marked differences between Formosan subterranean termites and our native subterranean termites. So Formosan subterranean termites, they belong to the species Coptotermes formosanus. These colonies can get huge. So a Formosan colony can be in the millions of individual termites. Okay, so we're talking millions of termites in a single colony. The soldier to worker ratio is also much higher. So it's usually right around 10% soldiers within a colony. And these soldiers are much more aggressive than our native Reticulotermes species. So you're dealing with larger colonies with more soldiers. These soldiers are aggressive. And they also have defensive secretions, right? So these Formosan soldiers, if you disturb them, if you have any kind of experience working with these in the field, you'll notice that once you start disturbing them, they will exude like a white glue-like substance from their fontanelle, so essentially their forehead. And what that does, it's not corrosive or acidic or anything like that, but it is very, very sticky, and it immobilizes any of their predators. So if that gets on an ant, it's going to get immobilized very quickly. Their swarm seasons are a bit different, and Formosan colonies can create aerial nests. So those are basically nesting above ground with no soil contact. So they are capable of doing that, but it can be rare. So when we talk identification, just wanted to point out as before, so soldiers and reproductives are very, very good specimens to use for taxonomy purposes for species identification. Okay, so if you have a group of worker termites, they don't really have these distinctive characteristics. So if you are looking to identify termites, you want to make sure that you have soldiers or reproductives in your specimen when you're talking to an entomologist. Okay, so our native subterranean termites, most of their identifying characteristics for the soldiers is different curvature of these mandibles, which you can see here. So for each one of these species, the mandible curvature is going to differ slightly. And when we look at the alates or the reproductives here, so you can see a little bit of color variation, a little size variation, but not really good things to go on here. However, R. tibialis and R. flavipes on the far left and far right. Can I use your laser pointer? Okay. So R. tibialis, you can see a white section on its foot right here, on its legs. And on flavipes, a very larger section of white coloration on these legs. So R. tibialis, you can think that these termites are wearing socks, whereas flavipes, you're looking at stockings. And another way to tell these apart, if you look at their eyes, actually there's where their simple eye and their compound eye, the space between there. So if you're looking at Reticulotermes virginicus versus flavipes, you can see that the simple eye is much further from the compound eye than it is in virginicus. So the soldiers of our native subterranean termites are also very much different than Formosan subterranean termites morphologically. So Formosan subterranean termites will have a teardrop shaped head on the soldiers with these very sharp, slender mandibles, whereas our native Reticulotermes soldiers will have a more rectangular shaped head with very blunt, thick mandibles. And some other identifying characteristics for the Formosan subterranean termites. If you look at the swarming termites, the reproductives, and if you're able to look at their wings under a microscope, you will notice millions of these tiny little hairs on those wings. That's another telltale sign here in Louisiana that you're dealing with Formosan termites. And as you can see here, the queens can be very distinctive looking themselves, right? So it's not very common to come across a subterranean termite queen, but if you are lucky enough, you will notice that it's basically a little termite head and thorax and this gigantic abdomen. So this abdomen is fully engorged with eggs. The termite queen is basically a large ovary with a head. I mean, that's kind of the analogy that I always use. So Formosan subterranean termites, like Mark said, they were imported after World War II. So after the war was over, all of the equipment and the wood crates to ship it in, they all came back from Southeast Asia, right? So this map here shows military installations in New Orleans that were around in 1945. If the Algiers Naval Station and the Port of Embarkation, and you have Camp Leroy Johnson right here, which is basically across the street from our administration building here in Louisiana. So it was imported after World War II in 1940, after 1945. And it wasn't discovered in Louisiana until the late 1960s. Okay, so that's a good 2 decades of just uninterrupted spread of Formosan subterranean termites. Nobody knew it was here. It's a very cryptic species, and nobody even knew to look for it. It was completely foreign. And once they got here to New Orleans, it was the perfect climate, right? It's really, really humid here, and it can be really hot in the summertime. Which they love. So they like that those warm temperatures and the high humidity. And they, like I said, they like to stay hidden. They nest underground. They're very cryptic, and people did not know to even look for them. We have wood sources everywhere for them to feed on. A lot of wood construction. We have wood debris under buildings. One common historical practice here in New Orleans is once a building was taken down, to put something else on top of it, you would just have that building come down. And instead of removing all of that wood and cellulose products, you would just build right on top of it. And termites love that. So as part of the southeastern US, we do have very heavy termite pressure when compared to the rest of the country. And when I say termite pressure, I mean that there is a lot of termites here. The risk of structural damage is much higher than it would be in the rest of the United States. And termites have had a huge impact in New Orleans. So we have a lot of historic structures here, and termites have done a number on some of those structures. We have a lot of ornamental trees, historic, iconic live oaks that can be, you know, a couple hundred years old, that termites have damaged. There have been massive alate swarms. So when the Formosan alates have swarmed in the past, you know, when I came on board here at mosquito control, I would hear these nightmare stories of, you know, well, there was a night baseball game and all the termites were swarming around the lights to the point that they had to pause the game, take a break until they were done swarming, and then get back to it. There can also be damage from falling trees and weakened structures as well. And it got to a point that this actually made headlines, not just here locally, but nationally as well. And way back in 2003, so 21 years ago, it was estimated that the annual cost of termite treatments and damage and repairs in New Orleans alone was $300 million. Now, granted, this was 20 years ago. These estimates have not been updated in the literature, uh, but I would imagine that these numbers would be much higher today. So in 1998, Operation Full Stop came about. And this was part of earmarked legislation. So it was federal funding. And it partnered a lot of people in the urban entomology realm. Okay, so we had not just our group, but USDA and LSU and other universities, University of Florida and Georgia and Hawaii, Mississippi State. We partnered with pest management professionals. So this was a huge effort, even teaming up with property owners in the French Quarter as well. So this was an initiative that took place between 1998 until 2012 is when the funding for this project ceased. But what the goals here were, it was for one to have a large area-wide termite control strategy for the French Quarter to protect historical structures and trees within the French Quarter. Okay, we also did a lot of research to improve detection technologies and termite control strategies. There was a lot of technology transfer and education going back and forth between folks from different universities and government entities, right? So there were different facets that were going on during Operation Full Stop. So one thing that happened was using bait technology to eliminate colonies. So you can see here, this is a map of each block within the French Quarter, and the dots on that map indicate the location of an in-ground bait station. Okay, we were also monitoring for alates using glue boards attached to streetlights throughout the French Quarter. So that kind of gave a relative abundance of where these swarms were taking place in the French Quarter. There was also a lot of building inspections, which is super important. Look, construction in the French Quarter, it can be bonkers at times, I guess would be, I don't know if that's the technical term, but you have very complicated construction. So you have shared walls, you have flat roofs that can hold water and create moisture issues. You have hidden areas. So if you look at the front of a building at the French Quarter, you have no idea what's going on behind there because there are courtyards behind there with plants that can be infested. So you have a lot of different construction practices happening there. We also did a lot of treating of trees for Operation Full Stop, not just with baits, but with liquid foam as well. And the research component, a lot of it dealt with really digging deep and looking at these foraging territories and the area that a termite colony can encompass, right, in a small area. And a lot of this was done by delineating colonies by mark release recapture or the genetic analysis that Mark was mentioning earlier. But with this mark release recapture, you take termites from the field, take them back to the lab, you force feed them dyed filter paper so that they turn either red or blue or one of those colors, and then you re-release them and track their movements that way by subsequent recapturing of them. So throughout, while Operation Full Stop was in full swing, we did notice that the number of alates in the French Quarter, they were reduced. So we monitored fewer and fewer of them. Termite activity in bait stations was reduced by over 98%. So that had baits had a huge impact on termites in the French Quarter. Inspections still showed some isolated pockets of infested trees and some above ground infestations. But overall, the termite pressure within the French Quarter was greatly reduced. So moving from Formosan subterranean termites, I just wanted to, reiterate some differences between drywood and subterranean termites. Drywood termites all fall within the family Serie-Termitidae, and I've mentioned it before, they live entirely in the wood that they're feeding on, so they have no soil contact. They get all the moisture that they need from the humidity in the air, their metabolism, and the wood that they're feeding on. But because they live entirely within something that they're feeding on, their range is not, the area that they're occupying isn't going to be as large as it would be for subterranean termites, so their colonies are going to be much smaller. Morphologically, there are some very big differences here between drywood and subterranean termites. So drywood termites typically have a set of very large mandibles with teeth on the inside of these mandibles, whereas you're not going to see that in subterranean termites, right? Subterranean termites have no teeth on mandibles, and they're usually much more slender than that. The pronotum is going to look a lot different too. So the pronotum is this plate-like structure that covers all or part of the thorax. So I always say it's analogous to somebody's neck. That's what it looks like. It looks like a termite neck. So it's going to be as wide as the head is on a drywood termite. And on a subterranean termite, that pronotum is going to be narrower than the width of the head. But not all drywood termite soldiers have these huge mandibles. Okay, there are species out there with very reduced, really non-functional mandibles. And these are the Cryptotermes species. Okay, so they have these very hard sclerotized head capsules. And this is not it's their defense mechanism that they use is not striking with mandibles or using defensive secretions. It actually allows them to plug entryways into the gallery system. So if ants or another predator are trying to get to termites within the colony, they can actually block those predators just by blocking the galleries with their head capsules. Now, drywood alates do vary from species to species with their coloration. But one that I really wanted to kind of point out is this light southern drywood over here on the far left, because it does look quite a bit like a Formosan subterranean termite alate. And their swarm seasons fall within pretty much the same months, even though Formosans will swarm at night. But if you're looking at glue boards and you see something that looks like one of these termites, you need to know what you're looking at, right? Because the control is going to be a lot different. Okay, so once again, if we look at the pronotum on a drywood alate, it's going to be as wide as the head is. And on a subterranean termite, it's going to be narrower than the width of the head. Okay, we saw before that there are going to be a ton of little hairs on the wings of a Formosan alate, and you're not going to have that on a drywood reproductive. Okay, and the wings on a drywood alate also have cross veins. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So here you can see it almost looks like hash marks connecting these two top veins in a drywood termite wing. So those are the cross veins. So if you look at a termite wing under a microscope and it has those cross veins, then it is a drywood termite. Whereas if you look at a wing under a microscope and it doesn't have those, then you're dealing with either a native subterranean termite if there's no hairs on it, or a Formosan subterranean termite if there are hairs on it. Now, we do have identification guides that they're offered as free downloads. If you want more information, more on identification, NOLA.gov/mosquito/document/termite ID guide. Okay, so talking a little bit about the life cycles of subterranean termites and drywood termites, I'm going to start here with the swarming reproductive termites. So these are very noticeable in May and June. They normally fly between Mother's Day and 4th of July. But they do swarm at night and they are attracted to light sources. So you'll see them a lot of times around street lights and things like that. And what they're doing is they are flying around, they are finding a mate, they're partnering up. The male will follow a female around in a tandem running pair while she searches for a new home. And then once they have mated, she will begin laying eggs, right? She does not start out this large. This is not a first year reproductive, but she can become very engorged with all those eggs. So the eggs hatch into what are called larvae. And these larvae can subsequently molt into soldiers, workers, or nymphs, right? And we've discussed soldiers and workers, but what are these nymphs? So these nymphs are actually going to be the future reproductive cast of termites. So this picture of this nymph up here, I don't know if you can see it in the picture, but they do have wing buds. Their bodies are much longer than workers. And they do have visible wing buds, and those will, molt again and become alates for the next swarm season. Now, if the queen stops producing as many eggs as she needs to for maintenance of the colony, or if one of the reproductives die, then, you can have termite larvae molting and becoming supplemental reproductives. Okay, so you can have multiple reproductives within a single colony as well. Now, with drywood termites, it is a little bit different than subterranean termites. So again, we have these termite reproductives. The alates will pair up and mate and lay eggs, but instead of a terminal worker caste, we have what are called suitor gates in a drywood termite life cycle. And this is basically a termite worker, but it's capable of molting again and going through the reproductive caste. Okay, so there's no terminal worker caste here. As we talk more about termite behavior, I'm going to pass it back on to Mark.
Okay, awesome. So again, this is kind of our first webinar, so stay tuned for the others. So I really like this one because I get to talk about how awesome termites are biologically and some of the really cool things they do. We will get into the control and their pest status a lot more as we continue. But termites are eusocial, and this is something that really brought my interest to them and kept me interested in them for a very long time still. And so this is a trait that's common in some bees, some wasps, all ants, and all termites. It's defined as having these three characteristics. So they have cooperative brood care. So brood is just a way of saying eggs and larvae of social insects. So this is especially when they're in a special chamber or a certain place. But you can see here the ants have all of these pupae and larvae that they're caring for and transporting around. So the individuals are not only caring for their own offspring, but they're caring for their offspring of their mother or of their siblings or of other individuals in the colony. There's that reproductive division of labor with that physiogastric, usually queen, because she's so modified, she has to have this enlarged body, so she's able to produce enough eggs, as she's the only egg layer in the colony. But in general, this reproductive division of labor allows some individuals to do some tasks and others to do others. So not every individual is reproducing. Some of them are forgoing their reproduction to help off the colony instead. And finally, there's overlapping generations. So they stick around for a long time and take care of offspring and offspring's offspring and so on for generations. So these three characteristics are the definition of eusociality. So this is a higher trait. There are other social insects like earwigs will take care of their young and different levels of subsociality. But for this, we're going to be focusing on this eusociality trait. So as I mentioned, all termites are eusocial, but they're unique from the other eusocial insects for a few reasons, and one of which is that they consume cellulose. So they're not doing this by themselves. Termites require this whole host of symbionts in their gut. These are bacterial, archaeal, and eukaryotic symbionts. If you take a termite and pull the gut out when it's alive, smash it on a microscope slide and take a look very close, you'll see something like this on the right side of the slide. I think it looks a little bit mouse-like. I'll let it wiggle here so you can see this little endosymbiont that was wiggling around the gut, is kind of stuck between the microscope slide and the cover slip, but it's wiggling along in there. So termites are very special in that they do this, and we'll kind of circle back to this when we talk about some of our different systems of controlling termites, and that we need to really target this cellulose feeding in baits and different things. Termites are known to have evolved from a cockroach-like ancestor. We actually consider termites a group within the cockroaches, so you could call termites eusocial cockroaches would be another name for them. But they have this aggregation behavior that, cockroaches usually aggregate in a certain area, but that doesn't make them social in the same way that termites are. But they are, that's this kind of type of cockroach. They also have to recover their gut symbionts from siblings. So each time a termite molts, they shed the lining of their gut as they shed their exoskeleton. So they shed all of their chitin, or their hard bone-like structure. And when they do this, they shed the lining of their gut and they lose all their symbionts. So they have to regain these from a colony member. So in doing so, this requires them to stay close to home. When you stay close to home, you might as well do something while you're sitting there waiting to get these symbionts back. So this may be part of why they evolved eusociality, or a trait along the way. Termites also use trophallaxis. This is common in social insects. This is a way of exchanging regurgitated liquids between colony members. This can be from mouth to mouth or from anus to mouth in different cases. This is how they're able to share food and also share those endosymbionts. So in termites in particular, some castes can't feed themselves. The larvae have mandibles, but they're not sclerotized. Sclerotized is just that hardening or stiffening of the exoskeleton. Usually the harder the exoskeleton is, the darker in color it is. So if you see this picture in the bottom left, all of these are larvae, and they have no sclerotization or hardening of their mouth parts. So they're not able to chew off the wood on their own. The soldiers on the other end of the spectrum have mandibles so large and so modified for defense that they also can't feed themselves. So they have to be fed by the colony from trophallaxis. These food sharing behaviors are, interesting biologically, but also an important characteristic we'll come back to when we talk about baiting systems and different methods of control. We already talked a little bit about colony defense, but I want to dig in a little bit deeper. So these soldiers have these three different types of heads. We've seen them, whether they're enlarged and have mandibles like the top. They can have those nozzle heads, like my unicorn termites, or they can have the phragmatic heads, as Carrie described. Phragmatic is that cryptic defense with blocking a nest structure with a hardened or modified head capsule. For termites, ants are their main enemy, so they're really gearing up to deal with ants and other things that are going to attack them in the soil. To have successful defense, they have to have this alarm communication. So they have to tell each other that there's something alarming. And most termites are blind. Only the alates and reproductive castes are the ones that have functioning eyes. The rest of them are basically moving around blind, and they rely on different cues. These are both chemical and vibroacoustic cues. For part of my PhD work, I was lucky enough to go to Prague to study some of these. So first we have our chemical cues, including pheromones from the frontal gland of soldiers. So a pheromone is a chemical released by an individual that affects the behavior or physiology of other individuals of the same species. And then the ones that I looked into were the vibroacoustic cues. So termites are actually tapping their head or their abdomen on the substrate to transfer this alert to the other individuals. Soldiers can tap, and they have a harder, bigger head, so usually it's a little bit louder of a sound, but workers can also tap in the colony as well. So I'm going to play this video here, and it's very quiet, so listen very closely. But this is a video that we took when I was in Prague with some collaborators. And what we did is we took a petri dish here. We didn't want to put anything in it, so we sanded the bottom of it so the termites were able to walk around. And then in the middle, oh, now I don't have my laser. In the middle of this is a little square. This is a very fancy microphone called an accelerometer. And this is actually able to pick up those individual taps. It can even pick up the footsteps, which are kind of background noise, but it can pick up the tapping pattern of these termites. And so what we did is for this, we have it tied together where the sound and the video are together for the sound from the accelerometer as recorded and the video that we had in there as well. The reason that I had to go to Prague is this had to be done in an anechoic room. So an anechoic room is just a fancy way of saying a silent room. So this was a massive chamber that was built at this university that had a suspended system that we were able to walk into there. So we weren't touching the chamber itself at all. We were on a net above the ground. And then it has tons of foam and blocks all sound. So when you go in there, it sounds like you put earplugs in and you can't hear anything at all. The whole room is silent. So we recorded this, and I'll play the video here. Again, listen very closely. It's very quiet, but you'll see them tapping their head, particularly in the kind of the middle to upper right of the plate, and you'll hear these small tapping sounds as well. There's one in the middle tapping, one in the top right tapping, another near the top right, in the middle, top. So you can see and hear them tapping, but this tapping pattern is unique to different species. Every species known does this, except for a few rare species that live in sand. There's no reason to tap in sand when the substrate won't actually transfer that communication to other individuals. And they do this when they're exposed. In this case, we kind of shook the plate right before we started the video, so the termites weren't happy and started tapping. But they do this to alert other members at a longer distance away that there are issues or problems in the colony. So finally, termite foraging. So we know termites are a problem because they're able to consume cellulose. So as you see here, these termites, this great video from Ed Freitag in our group, they're actually shredding off individual fibers of the wood here. So you can see this is a very slow process, but many hands make a light load. So with millions of termites in a colony, they can cause destruction. So as Carrie mentioned, these termites are actually beneficial. They're good to have in the environment breaking down this wood. Where it becomes a problem is that they're indiscriminate. They'll break down any wood that they come across. You could also kind of see the individual there was tapping a little bit. So if we had an accelerometer on this piece of wood, we might have some of those taps as well. So termites feed on any cellulose material. So many people think, well, it's not a piece of wood, so they won't feed on it. And wood is cellulose, but so is paper. So this is an example of some books that were on the shelf. The termites came up and were feeding on the paper of the book in there as well as a food source. I saw an example in a shed where they had a pallet of paper seed bags. And they had gone into there and had chewed little layers, and it looked like a full three-dimensional shape chewed out by the termites to be in their chambers in the middle. So they'll feed on anything with cellulose. And so cellulose is that indigestible carbohydrate that makes up the plant cell walls and vegetable fiber. It's very difficult to digest. As I mentioned, they have their symbionts, but humans aren't eating that. We don't have a dinner of paper or a wood steak for dessert. So this is not something that we're able to digest, so we don't have it in our diet. So termites also forage across a larger scale. So termites can nest and feed in multiple wood resources. We have kind of a schematic here of a few different colonies around an area, but the colony that's feeding on your house could be the same colony that's feeding on the tree nearby. They can move around and they have these distantly connected resources with underground tunnels or above ground tunnels in the case where they need to go across an area. But this is important to understand where they might be around an area and that they're constantly searching for a food source. So if you have termites in your tree in your backyard, those termites are constantly looking for more food. Even if you give them plenty of food and they have enough food resources where they're eating for their whole life, they're still going to search for more. They're never content. They're always searching, which means your house is always at risk. So it's always important to have protection out as they're constantly looking for these areas. They connect to these food resources by tunneling. So this is an example in a thin plate with 2 sheets of plexiglass with a little bit of sand. But you can see these tunnels are moving slowly. The time's ticking down there, the hours, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. So they're moving slowly, but they do this for a few reasons. So they're trying to acquire resources in different areas, and they need to maintain their nest-like conditions, very high humidity and very protected. These termites are very soft-bodied and very likely to dry out if they're out in the open, so they need to have this protected area that they're able to survive. They also don't want to run into predators like ants and different species. This is a video of a termite individually tunneling. Whoops. So this is the actual process of a termite tunneling through some sand in the lab. So you can see they pick up individual particles or a few particles and relocate them. So again, this is an extremely slow process where too much traffic occurs in the end of a tunnel. As some different research has shown, that's when they're going to start to build a branch. So you can see they're branching here because there's too many termites, not enough space. They spread out and start working on other areas. But again, this is a very, very slow process. But with tons and tons of termites and enough time, it can go on undetected and they can cause a lot of damage. This is an example of a mud tube made out of sand. And so they have these mud tubes that you might find around your house at different times. They're doing this to get into a resource. But as you see, when you disturb it, this was a highway going from food resource to another area. Initially, the soldiers will kind of peek out. The workers are scared by all of this this air and breach of the nest. The soldiers will come out and protect, and then we'll speed this up as kind of a time lapse, and you can see they're completely reconstructing this. So they need to have this highway or this tunnel to get back and forth. The soldiers' mandibles are so large they don't actually tunnel or move the sand themselves, but the workers are there with the soldiers overseeing in case an ant comes upon them or any other kind of predator. In the end, they'll completely reseal this as they need that humid, safe place. And by the end of this, you'll hardly be able to tell that this was disturbed at all. So they're very resourceful. This would be probably about 8 to 12 hours of time. So again, it's not super fast, but they can do a lot of work over time if they're left to it. Okay, so finally, I'll pass it back to Carrie in the home stretch here to talk a little bit about some of the economic importance.
Yeah, so again, we are going to be getting more into how important termites are as a structural pest in future webinars as well. But again, I do always like to show these figures a little outdated, so I'm sure that these numbers are even higher yet still. But it is so important to start with biology and identification because it's important to know thy enemy, right, in order to protect your home. So during this seminar series, we are going to be covering mostly subterranean termites, native subterranean termites, as well as the very invasive, destructive Formosan subterranean termite. We're going to be talking about how termite inspections are done and what to really look for during an inspection. Know how different pest species of termites are treated in your home. So for some species might require a fumigation, some you can use bait stations on, and it's going to be really important to know what you're dealing with to know how to treat your home. We're also going to have an entire webinar on how trees are protected, right? So that can be either with bait products or liquid termiticide with foam. So we're going to do a lot of talking about trees and like our historical trees as well as ornamentals as well. So that is going to conclude our termite biology and identification webinar for today. I hope all of you join us back here in 2 weeks when we discuss inspections and conducive conditions. That'll be Thursday, May 2nd. If you have any questions for us, go ahead and pop those in the chat. And while you're given an opportunity to put any questions in the chat, I'm going to let Mark explain this picture here. He is quite the fan of Mardi Gras parades. I'm going to let him explain what's up on the screen there.
I put the picture in there. This was actually a picture of a float from last year's Mardi Gras. So this was in the Muses parade, and they were doing different festivals, and so they had in festival. And in this is what a house looks like when it's fumigated. They put the tarp up around the house. and then put the fumigation gas or the fumigant into the house and do that. So this float decided to have some termites on there, as you see them kind of chewing on pieces of wood, and an exterminator on the front. But it was kind of a good jest of the termite fumigation that we see around town, and kind of a familiar thing there. But it was good to see this in the parade, some termite representation in our city.
Thanks, Mark. So we do have a question that came in the chat. It says, thanks for the excellent info. Can you explain why you call the termite new hatch larva if they go through incomplete metamorphosis?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's some nomenclature that we're stuck with. So what the question is referring to is that typically we use the word larvae to describe an insect that goes through complete metamorphosis. Something like a beetle or a caterpillar would have a larvae. Whereas we use the word nymph for something that goes through incomplete metamorphosis. Something like a grasshopper has a nymph because the little ones look like the big ones, except they have wings when they're adults. So a long time ago, some researchers, I believe in France, started using all of these names and didn't know those rules, and began to use the word nymph for those individuals, as Carrie described, that have wing buds that are going to become future alates. And then they used the word larvae, thinking it didn't matter what they used for the ones that hatch out of the egg. So although they don't go through full metamorphosis, we use the word larvae. The literature is a little too full of this reference. It would get very confusing to try to change it now and then go back and say, any literature past 2024 uses this terminology, any literature before uses this. So we've just kind of stuck with it, and it's never been fully corrected. But termitologists are technically wrong entomologically, but for simplicity, we're probably never going to change that. That's going to stay. Any other questions?
Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, then we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Part 2 will take place on May 2nd and will cover inspections and conducive conditions. And then again, this webinar will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel. Please call 311 to report any termite issues. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can email us at education@nola.gov. And the pictures of bait systems and liquid termiticides are for educational purposes only and do not represent any endorsement by the New Orleans Mosquito, Termite, and Rodent Control Board. And this presentation is to be used for educational purposes only. Thank you all again for being here, and have a good evening.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.